right, so the third and final relativist ethical theory we're going to explore here is called cultural relativism. Sometimes it's called conventionalism. And I think what you'll see as we explore the arguments here, that cultural relativism looks pretty similar to ethical subjectivism, but is sort of like subjectivism at the group or the cultural level. All right, so let's take a look at an argument justifying cultural relativism. Different societies have different moral codes. There is no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. The moral code of our own society has no special status. There is no universal truth in ethics. The moral code of a society determines what is right and wrong within that society. Therefore, we should reject arrogance and adopt an attitude of tolerance towards the practices of other cultures. All right. So again, you can see in these premise statements and even in the conclusion a lot of similarities to ethical subjectivism, except with cultural relativism, we're putting all the power for determining the truth value of moral claims, not in the individual, but in the group of individuals, right? So it's sort of like majority rule, or those who are in power are what determine what is expected and what is the norm for ethical behavior in a given society. Now, of course, we could challenge this argument by challenging the same three premises, or the three premises that look very similar to the premises in the argument for ethical subjectivism. We might be able to make the case that it's not true that there's no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's code is better than another. And if that can be proven, then these next two premises kind of fall away. Because if there is an objective standard, then maybe our society or some other society does have special status. And if there is an objective standard, then this statement here would be false. There would be some universal truth in ethics. Okay? Let's take a look at another rendition or expression of the cultural relativism argument. Premise number one, people's judgment about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. If people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. Therefore, right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. Okay? Now, of course, the first premise is true. People's judgment about right and wrong do differ from culture to culture. But I think we could challenge the second premise here, that just because that's the case, that doesn't necessarily indicate that right and wrong are relative to culture. Okay? Just because the Nazis said what they were doing was right doesn't make it right. Just because what slave owners were doing, just because what slave owners said that what they were doing was right doesn't make it right. Okay? So people can have different judgments about right and wrong, but that doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion that there's no objective standards that we could appeal to at all. Nonetheless, if we're cultural relativists, it is popular to be cultural relativists these days. Cultural relativists, we're going to put the cultural norms and expectations as the things that matter the most when determining whether or not a moral claim is true or false. So it sort of depends on, an action is right or wrong depending on where the action takes place. What's the group that provides the context for that action? If we go to some countries in the world, there are going to be actions that are morally permitted, like child brides, there that are not considered morally permissible here in the West. So does that mean that child bride marrying a child is morally permissible as long as we do it within the context of a group that approves of that? Because what the group thinks or expects is a perfectly appropriate reason to justify a moral claim. All right? So again, we come back to our cookie thieves, and we apply the cultural relativist argument to it. Whatever a particular culture regards as morally wrong is morally wrong and morally right. In American culture, taking the possessions of another person without that person's permission is regarded as morally wrong. That's exactly what these dumbest girls did. They took the Girl Scout cookie money without the permission of the little girl selling the cookies. Therefore, what they did was morally wrong. And you can see that, this argument makes sense. It's going to make sense. In America, this is the wrong thing to do. You did this thing. Therefore, what you did was wrong. But all of that's predicated on that first premise being the wrong-making feature of what these women did to the little girl selling Girl Scout cookies. Is what makes stealing wrong simply that the culture says it's wrong? If the culture said it was right, would it then be right, morally permissible? Okay? And again, we come back to our deserted island scenario. And we'll see one of the challenges of cultural relativism. Okay? Let's say everybody on this island is a cultural relativist. Everybody. But we've all come from different cultures. So we're all cultural relativists. And we've got to figure out a way to function as a group. But we all have very different moral standards. So what are we going to do? Kind of seems like we're either going to go to war, or we're going to create factions that are eventually going to lead to war or battle with one another, or we're going to have to start over from the beginning. We're going to have to figure out a way to convince people to embrace a particular set of values to operate from. And we're kind of right back at square one. So that's something to think about with cultural relativism, is it's sort of the status quo going forward and investing the status quo with a moral authority that seems to arise from it simply being the status quo.